At 11:17 on Christmas night, my father called me for the third time in less than 10 minutes. I almost ignored him. Hours earlier, he had told me not to be selfish after my entire family failed to show up for the dinner we had planned at my house. I thought the worst part of my Christmas was already over. Then I answered the phone. Dad didn't apologize. He didn't ask where I was. His first question made me look at the woman standing 20 feet away. Stay with me, because what that woman knew about my sister changed far more than one Christmas dinner, and subscribe if you want to hear what happened next. Christmas Day of 2026 had begun with the kind of confidence that comes from believing a plan has already been settled. Back in October, my family had agreed that dinner would be at my house this year. Not because I was the daughter who automatically hosted every holiday I wasn't, but because I had recently redone my dining room, and Dad had been the one to suggest we finally use the long table I kept claiming was too big for one person. We settled on 7:30. I wrote it on the paper calendar beside my refrigerator, and no one changed it. By noon on Christmas Day, my kitchen smelled like butter, rosemary, onions, and the orange peel I had tucked under the skin of the turkey. I had a glazed ham resting under foil, potatoes waiting to be mashed, green beans with toasted almonds, rolls covered beneath a clean towel, and a pecan pie cooling beside the window. I even made Serena's favorite cranberry relish, the one she always complained nobody else chopped finely enough. There was nothing heroic about any of it. I simply liked the feeling of making something carefully and then watching people enjoy it. The first thing that felt strange happened at 7:30, when the driveway remained empty. I turned the porch light on anyway. At 7:45, I lowered the oven temperature so the turkey would stay warm without drying out. By 8, I had stopped pretending not to check the front window whenever headlights moved along the street. Holiday traffic around Pittsburgh could be annoying, and I told myself that was all it was. My parents lived close enough that a delay made sense. Serena lived farther north, but still not far enough to explain complete silence. At 8:15, I sent one message to the family thread asking whether everyone was running late. Then I set my phone beside the butter dish and refused to stare at it. No one answered. The house became painfully quiet once I stopped moving. The candles I had lit before dinner had burned low enough for wax to gather around their bases. Condensation had fogged the inside of the dining room windows. 4 place settings sat untouched beneath the warm pendant light, each glass catching the reflection of the little white bulbs on the tree. I had folded the napkins twice because the first attempt looked uneven. That detail irritated me more than it should have. I had spent 10 minutes worrying about folded cloth for people who apparently could not spend 10 seconds telling me where they were. At 5 minutes to 9, I called Mom. Her voice carried the muffled noise of a crowded room behind it. Silverware, laughter, somebody moving dishes. She sounded surprised that I was asking where they were. Then she told me everyone was at Serena's house. Serena had decided to keep the gathering there after the family had already spent the late afternoon helping with a holiday donation drop for Second Hearth, the nonprofit she ran. For a second, I thought Mom meant they were stopping there before coming to me. Then she said Serena had told them I already knew about the change and might come later. I looked across my dining table at the plates waiting under the chandelier. I never spoke to Serena. The background noise on Mom's end seemed to recede. She began explaining that Serena had been certain, that everyone had already been there, that they assumed I had changed my mind. I could hear the uncertainty entering her voice, one word at a time. Then Dad took the phone. He did not ask whether Serena had actually called me. He did not ask why I had spent all day cooking if I had supposedly agreed to another plan. He heard the edge in my voice and decided the problem was my reaction. Don't be so selfish. My hand tightened around the phone. Across the table, Serena's cranberry relish sat in a small crystal bowl I had taken out because she once said food tasted more festive when it came in glass instead of plastic. I stared at it until the absurdity of that sentence almost made me laugh. Fine, then I'll be the most generous person tonight. I ended the call before the conversation could turn into one of those family arguments, where everyone repeated the same point until exhaustion was mistaken for agreement. For several minutes I stood in the kitchen with both palms pressed against the counter. I did not cry. I did not throw anything. I took the foil from the ham, replaced it carefully, then pulled every clean storage container I owned from the lower cabinet. Packing the food gave my hands something useful to do. Turkey in one container, ham in another, potatoes divided into smaller portions, rolls wrapped, vegetables sealed, pie cut into thick slices. I kept enough for myself the next day and loaded the rest into 2 insulated bags. By the time I zipped them shut, the anger had cooled into something harder and quieter. I had driven past a downtown warming center several times through work. Some of our hospitality clients donated excess supplies there during winter, and I knew Christmas night often strained every available bed. The roads were cold and mostly clear, with damp pavement shining beneath the streetlights. It took me a little under half an hour to reach the area. The center was full. A volunteer near the entrance was directing several people toward other overnight options while trying to distribute blankets and hot drinks. I could have left the food there. Instead, as I was carrying one of the bags back toward my car, I noticed a woman sitting near the transit station with a worn canvas tote tucked firmly between her shoes. She looked to be around 60. Her coat was too thin for December, but her posture was straight, almost formal. When I offered her food, she looked first at the containers, then at me, as though she was assessing what obligation might be hidden underneath them. Her name was Darlene Brooks. She accepted a plate after I told her there was no catch. I watched her unwrap a roll with careful fingers and take one small bite before setting the rest beside her. Something about that restraint made the sentence leave my mouth before good sense could stop it. "You'll never have to work again." Darlene slowly lifted her eyes. She did not smile. She did not cry. She looked at me the way an experienced teacher might look at a student who had confidently given the wrong answer. She told me, with dry amusement, that I had known her for roughly 10 minutes and probably should not start making lifetime financial commitments. Heat rose into my face. For the first time all evening, I laughed. That was when the night stopped being about proving anything to my father. The warming center had no bed for her, and when I asked what she wanted, she agreed to let me pay for one motel night somewhere nearby. One night, she emphasized. Not a rescue plan, not a promise. At the motel desk, I handed her my business card in case something went wrong with the room charge. Darlene read my name twice. Holloway. Her expression changed so subtly that I nearly missed it. She asked whether I was related to Serena Holloway. I said she was my sister. Darlene's fingers stopped on the edge of the card. "Your sister already helped me once. That's how I ended up back out here." The lobby suddenly felt too warm. I did not demand an explanation. Darlene looked exhausted, and I had finally learned enough in the previous hour not to turn another person's worst night into something I was entitled to inspect. But before I left, I sat in my car and typed one question to Serena. "Do you know Darlene Brooks?" I sent it at a few minutes after 11. Serena did not answer. Instead, about 15 minutes later, Dad's name lit up my screen. I let the first call stop. Then the second came. When the third began vibrating against the cup holder, I answered. There was no apology about dinner. No question about whether I had gotten home safely. Dad's voice was low and urgent. "What did that woman tell you?" Dad's question stayed between us for several seconds, while the motel sign pulsed red across my windshield. The engine was still running, blowing lukewarm air against my hands. Through the glass doors behind me, I could see Darlene waiting near the front desk, while the clerk finished processing the room charge. 15 minutes earlier, my father had not known where I was. Now he knew enough to be worried about what a woman he had never met might have told me. I asked him how he knew her name. He did not answer that directly. Instead, he said Serena had called him after receiving my text and warned him that Darlene was a former participant who had walked away from Second Hearth after refusing to follow the program. His tone had changed since our Christmas call. The irritation was still there, but beneath it sat something more careful. He told me Darlene had been offered help, housing support, and work opportunities, then rejected the structure required to keep them. I stared at the motel doors while he talked. He used phrases that sounded rehearsed rather than remembered. Resistant to the program, unwilling to follow work responsibilities, threatening to create trouble afterward. None of them sounded like words Dad would invent on his own. What caught me was how quickly the judgment arrived. Serena had called him only minutes earlier, yet Dad spoke as though he had been hearing about Darlene for much longer. When I pressed him, he admitted Serena had mentioned a woman months before who had complained about hearthworks and threatened to make trouble for Second Hearth. He had never met Darlene or asked what she complained about, but he already knew which version of her he believed. My message to Serena still sat unanswered on my screen. Instead of answering me, she had called Dad. I ended the call before it became another argument. Dad wanted me to promise that I would not get involved until Serena could explain everything properly. I told him only that I had heard him. I did not give him the promise. When I went back inside, Darlene was standing with the motel key card pinched between two fingers. She had wrapped the leftovers I gave her in a plastic bag the clerk found behind the desk. The food mattered to her. So did the fact that it belonged to her now. I noticed the way she kept the bag close rather than setting it on the counter. My first instinct was to start planning the next morning housing calls, emergency openings, maybe several more motel nights. The ideas lined themselves up with the efficiency of a work checklist. I stopped before turning Darlene's life into one. When I asked what she wanted, she chose one night, a shower, a locked door, and sleep. Tomorrow, she said, she could decide what tomorrow needed. At work, I was rewarded for anticipating problems before anyone asked. Standing there, I began to see how different that habit felt when the problem was another person's life. Before I left, Darlene asked whether I was going to call Serena again. I told her I had already texted once and had no intention of chasing my sister tonight. Darlene's shoulders loosened slightly. Then she told me that if I truly wanted to understand why her name made Serena nervous, I needed to hear the beginning before I heard the ending. So I stayed. We sat in two molded chairs near the motel's breakfast area, while an old television played silently above a vending machine. Darlene spoke without dramatizing herself. That made what she told me harder to dismiss. When she entered Second Hearth the previous January, she had been exhausted, embarrassed, and grateful. She had lost steady hotel work after a staffing change and had spent months trying to keep up with rent through temporary jobs. Once she fell behind, she never fully caught up. By the time she reached Second Hearth, what she needed most was not inspiration. She needed somewhere to sleep without calculating how many nights she could afford. Second Hearth gave her that. A bed, regular meals, a mailing address, and help replacing documents she had lost during a move. For the first time in weeks, she could leave a bag somewhere without carrying everything she owned with her. That part was real, she said. The fact that Darlene insisted on giving Second Hearth credit made the rest of her account harder to dismiss. The work component began normally. Hearthworks was presented as a way for residents to rebuild recent job history, practice schedules, and earn their way toward outside employment. Darlene had spent years cleaning hotel rooms and helping set banquet spaces, so staff quickly realized she needed almost no instruction. At first, she liked being useful again. A few hours folding linens or setting tables gave shape to the day. She knew how to move through a room without wasting steps, how to look at 20 untouched banquet tables and immediately see which one had been set incorrectly, how to turn over a guest room without leaving the feeling that somebody had rushed through it. Then the assignments began getting longer. What had been a supervised skills shift became a morning cleaning job for an outside client, then an event setup. Then a turnover assignment where Darlene and two other women did work she recognized as ordinary hotel labor, while Hearthworks remained the contractor. She said the language never changed as quickly as the work did. On the schedule, much of it still appeared under work readiness or training. To Darlene, the distinction became harder to understand because the clients were receiving a finished service, not watching residents practice. I asked whether she had been paid. She told me there had been small stipends and some paid assignments, but the way hours were classified never made sense to her. I stopped her there, before the conversation drifted into figures neither of us could verify that night. I was not a payroll specialist, and Darlene was not trying to argue a legal case. What she remembered clearly was simpler. The amount of productive work kept increasing, and the freedom to say no kept shrinking. The back of my neck went cold when I compared that arrangement with ordinary work. A vendor could decline an assignment, an employee could complain about a schedule and still go home at night. Darlene's bed was inside the same organization, judging whether she was committed enough to its program. She told me that by summer, refusing a Hearthworks assignment had begun to affect how staff described her attitude. Questions about hours became complaints about commitment. Complaints about commitment became conversations about whether she was taking the opportunity seriously. Serena was not personally standing over every schedule. Darlene made that clear too. But Serena had created the culture in which structure was treated almost like morality. People who followed the plan were moving forward. People who resisted were assumed to be resisting progress itself. I had heard my sister use versions of that philosophy for years. Not about homeless women, about everything. Serena loved systems, meal plans, calendars, goals divided into quarters. She could turn cleaning a garage into a color-coded project and somehow convince everyone else that the original mess had been a character flaw. Usually it was funny. Sometimes it was useful. Sitting beside Darlene under that buzzing motel light, it stopped being funny. I still could not turn one woman's account into a verdict on an organization I knew had housed real people. I told Darlene I needed to understand what happened before deciding what it meant. She seemed relieved. She was not asking me to hate Serena or accept every detail on faith. She wanted the chance to finish telling her own story before Serena's version replaced it. Before I left, Darlene told me one more thing. In November, while using a public library computer to check housing listings, she had looked up Second Hearth and found pieces of her story still appearing in donor material, a photograph of her in hospitality clothes, language about getting back to work, language about stability. She had never seen her final internal case classification, and nobody from the organization had called to ask whether she had actually landed where that public story suggested. I drove home after midnight, with the heater blowing against my feet and Dad's words circling uselessly in my head. He had called Darlene someone who walked away from help. Darlene had described herself as someone who walked away when the price of that help kept changing. Both versions could not carry the same meaning. My house smelled faintly of rosemary when I walked back inside. The dining room candles had burned themselves out. I left the plates where they were, opened my laptop at the kitchen counter, and searched for one thing only: the Second Hearth year-end campaign page I remembered sharing with a colleague earlier that month. It took less than a minute to find. I scrolled past Serena's smiling photograph, donor statistics, and familiar language about dignity and fresh starts. Then my hand stopped on the trackpad. Darlene was standing beside a neatly made hotel bed, wearing dark housekeeping trousers and a pale work shirt. She looked tired but proud. I recognized the same direct gaze she had given me outside the warming center. Beneath her photograph were 6 words: back to work, back to stability. By the time daylight reached my kitchen on December 26th, the Christmas table still looked almost exactly as I had left it. The candles had burned down to hardened pools of wax. Serena's cranberry relish remained untouched in its crystal bowl. One of the napkins had slipped sideways during the night, and for some reason that crooked square of fabric bothered me more than the empty chairs did. My phone held a message from Mom, asking if we could talk once everyone had calmed down. I read it without answering. 24 hours earlier, I would have been replaying Dad's accusation, wondering whether I had overreacted by leaving the food behind instead of driving to Serena's and pretending the misunderstanding did not matter. That morning, the family argument had been pushed to the edge of my attention by a photograph on my laptop: Darlene Brooks, standing beside a neatly made hotel bed. Back to work. Back to stability. I enlarged the page, then immediately felt foolish for doing it. There was no hidden clue in the pixels, no confession buried in the caption. It was exactly what it appeared to be: a polished donor story built around a woman's second hearth, wanted people to see as proof that its model worked. What unsettled me was not that Serena had once celebrated Darlene's progress. Darlene herself had told me the program genuinely helped her at first. What bothered me was that the story was still being used in December, more than 2 months after Darlene had left Second Hearth, and while she was sleeping wherever she could find a safe place. Then I noticed something lower on the page, my own name. I had forgotten about the testimonial until I saw it again. There was nothing dramatic in the wording. I had described Hearthworks as a reliable community workforce partner and praised how professionally its crews had handled a small vendor pilot. Beneath the quote sat my name and job title. I closed my eyes for a moment and remembered exactly how that sentence had come into existence. Serena had approached me in February of 2025, almost 2 years before that Christmas night, when Hearthworks was still trying to build a larger client base. She knew my company regularly contracted outside crews for hospitality events, property turnovers, and short-term service work. She did not ask me to donate money. She asked for an introduction. That distinction had mattered to me at the time. I did not like the idea of doing business with somebody simply because she was family. So I had insisted Hearthworks go through the same small vendor pilot we used for other community partners. They completed several assignments during March and April. The crews arrived on time. The supervisors seemed organized. The clients gave positive feedback. I saw residents working beside staff at 2 of those assignments. They wore name badges, took direction, and moved with the kind of confidence that made the program look exactly like what Serena said it was. Paid work experience designed to rebuild employment history. I never asked to see payroll. I never asked how many hours were considered training. I never asked what happened if someone refused an assignment. Those questions had not felt relevant to my role. I was evaluating whether a vendor showed up and completed the work we had hired it to do. Serena was my sister, but more importantly, in that moment I had treated her as the head of a legitimate nonprofit and accepted her explanation of how it operated. In May, she asked whether she could quote me in a donor packet. I reviewed the sentence, made sure it did not claim anything I had not personally seen, and said yes. At the time, that felt responsible. Looking at my name beneath Darlene's photograph, it felt incomplete. I did not suddenly decide I had participated in some hidden scheme. That would have been its own kind of vanity, imagining every bad thing had somehow revolved around my choices. But I had given Serena something valuable without recognizing its value. My name, my company title, and the fact that a real business had hired Hearthworks made the program look tested from the outside. Whether Serena had used that credibility fairly was now a question I could no longer ignore. I called her late that morning. I kept the conversation narrower than she expected. I did not accuse her of exploiting anyone. I asked what happened when Darlene left Second Hearth. Serena's answer arrived smoothly. Darlene had entered the program with promise, she said, but struggled with structure. She had stopped cooperating with the work readiness component, resisted scheduling, and eventually left despite available support. Serena described it as a disappointing outcome rather than a scandal. For a few minutes, I understood why Dad believed her. Serena did not sound frightened. She sounded tired. She reminded me that Second Hearth worked with women in crisis, which meant not every relationship ended happily. Some people left early. Some rejected rules. Some blamed the program afterward because blaming a structure was easier than admitting they were not ready for it. None of that was impossible. Darlene had been angry. She had walked away. Serena had run the program for years. If I wanted the truth, I had to leave room for the possibility that 2 people could describe the same collapse differently. Then Serena said that Darlene had always had difficulty accepting her work responsibilities. The phrase caught. I asked what she meant by work responsibilities. There was a brief pause, small enough that I might not have noticed it if I had not spent years listening to vendors revise explanations when they realized a contract term mattered. Serena corrected herself. She meant work readiness hours, training, the normal requirements everyone agreed to when entering Hearthworks. She moved on immediately, but I did not. The words had changed while the underlying activity apparently had not. Before ending the call, Serena asked whether Darlene was still with me. I told her Darlene had a room for the night and that anything beyond that was Darlene's decision. Serena warned me not to let one unhappy former participant turn me against an organization that had helped dozens of women. I did not argue. What stayed with me after the call was not Serena's defense. It was how familiar her language sounded. Structure, responsibility, commitment. People who succeeded were people who understood expectations. People who questioned expectations became people who had trouble with structure. I had heard versions of that logic at family dinners long before Second Hearth existed. Later that afternoon, Darlene called from the motel. She had slept, showered, and eaten enough leftover turkey to joke that I had tried to feed an entire football team. The humor disappeared when I summarized Serena's version of her departure. Darlene did not explode. She became very still. Through the phone, I could hear the hum of the motel heater behind her. She said there had been one person inside Second Hearth who heard her original complaint before everything deteriorated. A program coordinator named Nia Benton. Darlene had complained to Nia in August, weeks before Darlene finally left. Nia had already been uneasy about how Hearthwork's schedules were changing. Then, near the end of that same month, Nia resigned. I asked whether Darlene wanted me to contact her. Darlene said no. She wanted to do it herself. That answer would have frustrated me 2 days earlier. By then, I understood why it mattered. Darlene found an old number and sent the message. She did not tell Nia what to say. She told her only that June Holloway, Serena's sister, had met her and was trying to understand what happened. Nia agreed to meet us the following day. We chose a small diner halfway between my suburb and downtown, the kind of place where coffee appeared before you finished removing your coat. Nia arrived carrying nothing but her purse and a tired expression. No files, no laptop, no dramatic stack of evidence. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with the careful posture of somebody who had spent months training herself not to say more than she could prove. Darlene told her what Serena had said about leaving voluntarily. Nia listened without interrupting. When Darlene finished, Nia looked at me. She told me first what she could not do. She could not tell me how Serena ultimately closed Darlene's case because she had resigned before October. She had not seen the final classification, and she would not pretend otherwise. That restraint made the next sentence heavier. I can't tell you how Serena closed Darlene's file. I was gone by then, but I can tell you why I was afraid of how she might close it. Nia let the sentence sit between us while the waitress refilled 3 coffee cups and moved away without noticing how still our table had become. Outside the diner windows, the parking lot was gray with old winter slush, the kind that looked less like snow than something the city had already given up on. Darlene kept both hands around her mug. I had the sudden urge to ask Nia for dates, documents, names, proof, anything that would turn uncertainty into something I could organize. Instead, I waited. Nia began with the part she thought mattered most. Second Hearth had helped people. She had watched women arrive with nowhere safe to sleep and leave with jobs, apartments, and real stability. Hearthworks had also begun with genuine short training shifts and properly paid client work. The problem developed gradually. Businesses liked reliable crews and low fees. Residents gained recent experience. Serena gained revenue that helped support the housing program. The trouble began when the most reliable residents became too useful to keep treating as trainees. Residents who already knew hospitality work were the easiest people to send back to clients. They required less supervision, made fewer mistakes, and generated fewer complaints. That meant women like Darlene kept being scheduled. What had once been a 2-hour skills shift could become a full turnover job. Event setup that began as practice became an assignment where a client expected a finished room on time. The terminology on internal schedules did not always change with the reality of the work. Nia had raised concerns before Darlene ever complained. She worried that the more Hearthworks depended on client revenue, the harder it became to tell the difference between teaching somebody how to work and simply using somebody who already knew how. Serena's answer, according to Nia, was always practical. Hearthworks needed to function in the real world. Clients paid for results. Participants needed real expectations if they were going to keep real jobs. Revenue helped keep beds available. I could hear my sister saying every word of it. It only changed when I imagined hearing the same logic, while my bed depended on whether the program approved of my response. Darlene's complaint had started over hours, not ideology. By July, she was being placed on more outside assignments because hospitality work was the thing she did best. She did not object to working. She objected to being told that work she could have performed for a hotel, catering company, or cleaning contractor was still merely training when Hearthworks was collecting a client fee. Nia remembered the first formal complaint because Darlene had been unusually specific. She had not come in shouting. She had written down dates and asked why one type of assignment counted differently from another. Nia did not tell me numbers she could no longer verify. She only remembered that the question made sense. The hardest moment came at an event late that summer. Darlene filled in the rest. Hearthworks had been assigned a large evening setup. She expected several hours of work and had dressed for exactly that. The job ran late. Tables had to be reset after a layout change. Linens were wrong, and part of the crew stayed to finish because the client needed the room ready before morning. By the time Darlene was done, midnight had passed. She had a mandatory program session the next morning. Darlene told the scheduler she would not make it after working that late. The response was not framed as a request for rest or a scheduling problem. It became a conversation about commitment. The same thing happened when she resisted another assignment soon afterward. Her refusal changed the language around her. Reliable became difficult. Independent became resistant. Experience became evidence that she thought she was above the program. Darlene recited the labels without bitterness, as if they had already been attached and filed away. I thought about the vendor reports I had seen in 2025. Hearthworks had been inexpensive. At the time, I had admired Serena for making a nonprofit operation competitive. I remembered one procurement conversation where a colleague commented that Hearthworks could do a small turnover project for less than another vendor had quoted. I had assumed donations, subsidies, and nonprofit overhead explained the difference. I wondered whether part of that price difference had been absorbed by people who could not negotiate like ordinary workers because their housing was tied to the same organization scheduling them. But the low price was only a memory, not proof of why it was low. Nia seemed almost relieved when I said that aloud. She had spent months, she told us, afraid that if she spoke about what bothered her, people would demand that she prove every suspicion, as if concern itself were worthless unless it arrived with a verdict attached. What she could say was narrower. She had seen the boundaries around work readiness assignments stretch. She had watched objections become notes about attitude. And she had watched Serena become increasingly focused on outcomes. How many women completed the program? How many left for work? How many could be counted as stable? By August, Nia no longer trusted the way those categories were being discussed. Darlene's complaint was part of why she left, but not the only reason. Nia had already been pushing back internally. When she resigned on August 28th, Darlene was still living at Second Hearth. Nia never saw what happened in October when Darlene finally left. That boundary mattered. Nia had left before Darlene's final case classification existed, and she never claimed to know what it said. Whatever came next would have to come from Darlene's own record. Before we left the diner, Nia told Darlene that Second Hearth's participant handbook allowed former residents to request their own case closing summary. It was not a secret legal loophole. It was simply part of the program's record access policy. Darlene had never requested hers because, until Christmas night, she had been more concerned with finding a safe place to sleep than with learning what Serena had typed after she walked out the door. This time, Darlene decided she wanted it. She made the request herself. I did not send it for her. I did not word it. I did not attach an accusation. Watching her type the short message on her phone required more restraint from me than I would like to admit. There were half a dozen things I wanted to suggest. She needed none of them. 2 days later, while I was back at work trying to behave like my life had returned to ordinary vendor problems, Dad called. His voice was calmer than it had been Christmas night, which somehow made the conversation worse. He reminded me that Second Hearth had housed dozens of women. He talked about Serena's years of work, the donors who trusted her, and the people who would be affected if every former participant's complaint were treated like proof of misconduct. He was not entirely wrong. That irritated me most. I asked him one question. Had he ever met Darlene? The silence was brief. No. He had heard about her from Serena. He had heard that she was angry, difficult, unwilling to follow structure. That had been enough. After we hung up, I sat at my desk looking at a sample contract I was supposed to review and thinking about how easy it was to mistake familiarity for knowledge. Dad knew Serena. Therefore, he believed he understood Darlene. I knew Serena too. For more than a year, I had done a quieter version of the same thing. That afternoon, my phone rang again. This time, it was Sonia Patel. I knew her name from Second Hearth fundraising material, but we had never spoken directly. She introduced herself as board chair and told me Darlene's request for her case closing summary had reached the administrative side of the organization. Serena had also informed the board that a family dispute was now touching questions about Hearthworks. Sonia did not sound alarmed. She sounded precise. She said she was not interested in taking either sister's side. Then she asked me one question before she looked at anything else. Tell me exactly what your company knew about Hearthworks. Sonia's question followed me home from work that evening because there was no flattering way to answer it. My company knew that Hearthworks existed. We knew it provided hospitality crews. We knew Serena described part of the model as work readiness and part as paid client assignments. We knew the crews we hired showed up on time, finished the work, and received good feedback from the people supervising the properties and events. That was the extent of it. We had never reviewed how Second Hearth decided which hours were training. We had never examined whether refusing an assignment could affect housing status. We had never audited payroll. We had never claimed to. I told Sonia all of that. I also told her the part that made me look careless. I had trusted Serena when she said productive work was being handled appropriately because she was my sister and because everything I saw from the outside appeared organized. I had recommended a limited vendor pilot without asking questions that now seemed painfully obvious. Sonia did not comfort me. That helped. She did not tell me I could not have known. She did not call me brave for admitting it. She simply made notes and asked a few narrow questions about what assignments my company had purchased and what I had personally observed. When we finished, the distinction was clean enough to hurt. I had seen good service. I had not seen the system underneath it. That was all I was entitled to say. 2 days later, Darlene received her case closing summary. It did not arrive in a dramatic envelope. No courier appeared at my door. No secret file was slipped across a table. Administrative staff at Second Hearth sent the document directly to Darlene after processing the request she had made under the program's own policy. She called me only after she had read it herself. I drove to the motel because she asked me to come. Darlene had the pages folded once on the little desk beneath the window. She did not hand them to me immediately. That small delay mattered. 3 days earlier, I might have reached for them the moment I walked in. Now I sat in the chair across from her bed and waited until she pushed the paper toward me. The document was short. That almost made it worse. There were no pages of complicated language to hide behind. The summary coded Darlene's departure as a voluntary transition to an employment-linked housing placement, wording that presented the next stage of stability as an achieved program outcome rather than an unresolved possibility. I read the sentence twice. Darlene watched my face. I never moved into that housing. She did not need to say anything else. I already knew what October had looked like from her side. She had objected to Hearthworks assignments. Her commitment rating had deteriorated. Nia had already resigned by the time Darlene finally left. Darlene had slept on couches afterward, then moved between temporary shelters until those options ran out. By Christmas night, I had found her outside, near a transit station, with everything she owned close enough to touch. But according to the summary in front of me, Darlene had transitioned. The words sat on the page, like a door someone had painted onto a wall. I slowed myself down. A bad case summary was not proof of a conspiracy, and people could lose stability after leaving a program. But Darlene was not describing a later collapse. She had never accepted that placement, never moved into it, and had not left believing stable housing had been secured. There had been earlier discussion of housing possibilities, but nothing was arranged when she walked out in October. The summary was not merely outdated, it described an outcome that had not happened. I opened the second Hearth donor page on my phone. Darlene's photograph was still there. Back to work, back to stability. One page alone could have been marketing that had not been updated quickly enough. One case summary alone could have been sloppy administrative language. Together, they formed something harder to explain away. Darlene had left after a conflict over work assignments. The internal closing language framed that departure positively. The public campaign continued presenting her as a symbol of stability. And nobody, as far as Darlene knew, had checked whether the life being described still existed before using her face to raise confidence in the program. I thought of Serena telling Mom and Dad that I had agreed to Christmas at her house. The stakes were nothing alike, but the motion was familiar. Instead of asking what another person had chosen, Serena supplied the version that kept things moving. I did not compare my ruined dinner aloud with Darlene's months of instability, but the pattern had become difficult to ignore. I called Serena that afternoon. This time, I did not ask about Darlene's attitude. I did not ask what kind of participant she had been. I read the classification aloud and asked why it described an employment-linked housing transition when Darlene said she had never moved into any such housing. Serena did not deny the wording. She explained that program closure summaries reflected the plan and status surrounding departure, not a guarantee of permanent stability. People left with referrals, employment possibilities, and housing pathways that sometimes failed later. Second Hearth could not follow every former participant forever. It was a reasonable explanation until it reached the one fact that would not fit. Darlene was not saying the housing failed later. She was saying it had never happened. I told Serena that. The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to register. Then she shifted away from Darlene's specific case and toward the danger of using one disputed file to question an entire organization. She reminded me of the women Second Hearth had housed successfully and warned that donor confidence could be fragile once accusations started circulating. The warning beneath Serena's explanation was not quite a threat. It was a hierarchy. The program had helped many people, so one contradiction was being treated as a problem to contain rather than a reason to examine the system. That evening, Mom called again, hoping to smooth over Christmas. She said Serena had been under pressure and that the change had been handled badly, but she still had not asked Serena the simplest question. Had Serena actually spoken to me before telling them I knew? Mom was still treating it as a misunderstanding. I was no longer willing to settle it through assumptions. I told her only that Christmas was not the largest problem in front of me anymore. Sonia called the next morning. She had now spoken directly with Darlene and reviewed the case closing summary with Darlene's permission. She was careful not to declare what the document proved. That was not her role yet. But the discrepancy was significant enough that the board could not treat the matter as a family argument anymore. Second Hearth would open a preliminary review. I stood at my kitchen counter listening to the refrigerator hum, aware that the story had just crossed a line none of us could uncross. Then Sonia told me there was another issue she needed clarified. Serena had described my company's relationship with Hearthworks as evidence that outside professionals understood and accepted the model. Sonia paused before asking the question that made my stomach tighten. Your sister says your company's partnership proves outside professionals understood the model. I need to know exactly what she means by that. Sonia's question forced me to look at something I had been avoiding since I found my own name on that donor page. Not what Serena had done with Hearthworks, but what my involvement had allowed other people to assume. I pulled up the original testimonial from May 2025 and read it slowly. The wording was narrower than I remembered. I had praised Hearthworks as a reliable community workforce partner. I had mentioned punctual crews, professional supervision, and good service during our vendor pilot. I had not said anything about payroll compliance, housing rules, or how residents were classified inside Second Hearth. I had never claimed to audit any of that. On paper, the distinction was clear. My company had hired Hearthworks, I had recommended the pilot, and I had allowed Serena to attach my name and title to a positive quote. To an outside donor, that could sound like someone in hospitality had examined the whole model. I had not. Serena had not forged an endorsement. She had stretched a real relationship beyond what it actually proved. I told Sonia exactly that. She listened, then said the board needed to separate three questions that people had been blending together: whether Hearthworks provided useful services, whether some participants received legitimate training, and whether every hour and housing-related consequence had been handled appropriately. None of those questions could answer the others. Sonia's distinction mattered because Serena kept letting one true fact answer a different question. The program had helped women. Some training was legitimate. My company had received good service. None of those facts proved what Serena wanted them to prove about every participant, every hour, or every housing consequence. The next step embarrassed me in a different way. I had to tell my employer. I did not dramatize it. I explained that a nonprofit vendor I had introduced through a family connection was under preliminary board review, that questions had emerged about how some participant work was classified, and that my own testimonial might have been used more broadly than I understood. I asked that we pause any new Hearthworks assignments until the facts were clearer. The response was professional rather than comforting. My company preserved the contracts, invoices, an ordinary vendor records it already had, and agreed not to start new work with Hearthworks while the review was open. Nobody praised me for transparency or accused me of wrongdoing. My job was simpler: own the recommendation I had made and make sure nobody treated it as proof of conditions I had never examined. I had seen good work in 2025. I had not seen the system underneath it. Sonia moved faster once the issue crossed from a family complaint into a governance question. She did not tell me everything the board discussed, and I did not ask her to. What she later explained was enough. Second Hearth formed a small special committee, retained outside employment counsel, and brought in a nonprofit compliance and payroll consultant to review the work model, participant records, and how Hearthworks assignments had been handled. Serena was not removed immediately. That mattered. The board was not interested in staging a public punishment before it understood the facts. But Serena no longer had unilateral control over participant discipline, Hearthworks records, or decisions that could affect women who raised concerns while the preliminary review was underway. The shift was administrative on paper. Emotionally, it was enormous. For years, Serena had been second hearth in the eyes of our family. She founded it, she spoke for it, she interpreted every success and every failure. Now, for the first time, other people were going to look at the same system without relying on her explanation as the final one. That was when Serena called me. She did not shout. I almost wished she had. Anger would have been easier to reject than reason. She told me the board's response was becoming disproportionate. Darlene's case, she said, could be corrected. Her closing summary could be amended. Second Hearth could help reconnect her with housing. If compensation had been mishandled, that could be reviewed too. She laid it out like a practical repair plan. For several seconds, I understood the temptation. Darlene needed stability. She had spent weeks cycling through temporary places after leaving Second Hearth. Serena was offering to fix the record, address money, and help with housing. If the original problem had been one person mishandled inside an otherwise useful program, that might have been exactly what responsible leadership looked like. But there was a question I could not get past. I asked whether the same review would be offered to anyone else whose work assignments and exit coding raised similar concerns. Serena's answer came after a pause. This is about Darlene. That one sentence changed the entire offer. She was not describing correction. She was describing containment. If Darlene could be made whole quietly, then the problem could remain Darlene-shaped. One unhappy former participant, one bad ending, one corrected file. No one would have to ask whether the same system had produced similar harm for somebody less persistent, less articulate, or less lucky than Darlene had been when she happened to meet me on Christmas night. I did not accuse Serena of bribery. That would have been dishonest. She was offering things Darlene might genuinely need and might be entitled to. The problem was the condition wrapped around the offer. Stop widening the issue. I told Serena I could not decide that for Darlene. Then I ended the call before it turned into a debate. My hands were cold afterward, even though I was sitting in my own kitchen. The winter light had faded early, leaving the window above the sink black enough to reflect my face back at me. A week earlier, I had stood in that same room packing Christmas dinner because I wanted to prove to Dad that I was generous. I had treated generosity like a lever, something I could pull to change the way the night felt. Serena was offering a more polished version of the same instinct. Fix the visible pain quickly, control the next step, and make the uncomfortable question disappear. I called Darlene because the decision belonged to her. I summarized Serena's offer without adding my interpretation. Housing assistance, a corrected case record, a review of money she might be owed. Serena wanted the matter kept narrow, while Second Hearth handled it internally. Darlene was quiet for a long time. I could hear traffic through her side of the call, and the soft rattle of the motel heater. I waited instead of filling the silence. When she finally spoke, she did not ask how much money there might be, or what kind of housing Serena meant. She asked one question. If I take the bed, does everybody else disappear? I looked at the kitchen table, where I had once thought a full meal could answer the humiliation of an empty room. For the first time since Christmas, I had no useful answer ready. Darlene's question stayed with me because either answer carried a cost. Serena's offer could give her immediate help, and Darlene had no obligation to sacrifice relief for a cleaner moral argument. But if the solution ended with her, everything we had learned could still be reduced to one unfortunate case. The preliminary review was beginning to test whether that explanation could hold. Sonia did not keep me informed about every interview or every internal discussion. She made that boundary clear, and I respected it. What reached me came only through people who chose to tell me, or through the parts of the process that directly involved my own testimony. That meant the story moved more slowly than my imagination wanted. There were no dramatic discoveries every morning. Mostly there were days when I went to work, answered ordinary emails, drove past winter gray parking lots, and wondered what was happening inside a building where Serena had once seemed to control every definition that mattered. Then a former Second Hearth participant contacted me. She had heard enough about the review to know my name was involved and wanted me to understand something before I decided my sister's entire program had been a lie. I met her in a coffee shop on a cold January afternoon. She did not come to accuse Serena. She came to defend her. The woman told me Second Hearth had given her exactly what it promised. A safe place to sleep, help getting identification replaced, a structured routine when her life had fallen apart. Hearthworks gave her recent references, and eventually she moved into ordinary paid employment and then into an apartment of her own. She remembered Serena as demanding. She also remembered Serena as the person who refused to let her disappear inside her worst year. I listened. I did not tell her about Darlene in detail. I did not explain why her success story might still coexist with somebody else's harm. I simply let her experience remain hers. Walking back to my car, I understood why the review felt so dangerous. Serena was not defending an empty shell. Women were still sleeping safely in rooms Second Hearth had created, and some former participants credited the program with rebuilding their lives. The existence of real good did not answer whether Serena had the right to decide whose harm counted. My parents were wrestling with the same problem, although they reached it from a different direction. Mom called me after finally asking Serena the question she should have asked on Christmas night. Had Serena actually spoken to me before telling them I knew about the change? Serena admitted she had not. Everyone was already at her house after the donation drop, and she had assumed I would understand and come over. She had not misunderstood me. She had skipped me. Dad now knew that too. For several days, I wondered whether that would change anything. It changed something, but not enough. When Dad called, there was less certainty in his voice than before. He admitted Serena should never have told them I knew about the Christmas change. He did not defend that anymore, but he separated it from Second Hearth almost immediately. One family mistake, he argued, should not be used to judge years of work helping vulnerable women. I stood at the sink with water running over a plate I had already washed. Dad finally had proof that Serena had spoken for me without permission, yet he still wanted that behavior separated from everything happening at Second Hearth. I asked only why a proper review frightened him, if the program was as sound as he believed. Dad had no answer that did not eventually return to consequences. Donors could leave, programs could lose money, women could lose services. A reputation damaged by an accusation might never recover, even if every allegation proved exaggerated. He was right about that too. By then I was learning that being partly right could be more dangerous than being completely wrong. Darlene felt the weight before I did. She called me 2 days later and said she was thinking about withdrawing from the review. She had not changed her story. She had not suddenly decided Serena had treated her fairly. But once the board began protecting records and restricting Serena's control over participant discipline, the possibility of larger consequences stopped feeling theoretical. Darlene knew women were still living at Second Hearth. She knew what it felt like to have a bed and then lose it. The thought that her complaint might contribute to funding problems made her voice thinner than I had ever heard it. My first impulse was to persuade her to continue. I pressed my thumb against the edge of the phone and waited instead. What Darlene actually wanted to know was whether I would be angry if she stopped. I told her the decision was hers. She did not withdraw that day, but neither did she promise to continue. The review moved forward because it was no longer resting on her alone. Nia gave her statement to the board's outside reviewers. She kept it as narrow as she had promised me from the beginning. She described the period before her August resignation, when Hearthwork's training hours were stretching into more productive client work. She explained that complaints about scheduling increasingly became discussions about attitude and commitment. She also acknowledged Serena's constant concern that weaker outcome numbers could threaten future funding. Nia did not claim Serena ordered anyone to falsify Darlene's final record. She had left before it existed. Her statement stayed limited to what she had actually seen, which made it harder to dismiss as revenge. Then Sonia called me with something more immediate. She was careful about privacy. A current participant named Keisha Moore had raised a concern directly with the review. Keisha had given permission for Sonia to tell me the substance, because my earlier vendor statement was now part of the same inquiry. Keisha had not made a sweeping accusation. She had asked whether challenging her Hearthworks hours could affect her bed. Sonia did not recreate a private scene I had not witnessed. With Keisha's permission, she gave me only the substance of the concern. The question was enough. Within the review, the board separated housing eligibility decisions from Hearthwork scheduling and work-related discipline. Whatever else happened, a resident raising a concern about assignments would not have that concern decided by the same chain of authority controlling whether she remained in housing. It was a small administrative change. I imagined what that separation would have meant to Darlene in July. Then I imagined how many decisions inside Second Hearth had seemed voluntary only because the alternative sat one locked door away. That evening, Serena called. Her voice was controlled, almost exhausted. She did not mention Keisha by name. She did not need to. She knew the board had begun limiting her authority and that Hearthworks could no longer operate as though nothing had changed. For the first time, she sounded less worried about her reputation than about what the review might do to the organization itself. She reminded me that beds cost money, staff cost money, buildings cost money. Hearthworks revenue mattered. Donor confidence mattered. Pausing assignments and opening every grievance to outside scrutiny could create consequences no one intended. I listened because some of it was true. Then her voice hardened. You wanted to be generous? You may have just cost women their homes. After the call ended, I stayed beside the dark kitchen window with the phone still in my hand. For the first time since Christmas, Serena had said something I was genuinely afraid might come true. Serena's warning followed me for days because women really did depend on second hearth. If the review damaged funding or forced hearthworks to stop outside work, people who had done nothing wrong could feel the consequences. That made Serena's next argument more effective than anger would have been. By early February, the preliminary review had moved far enough that her defense began to change. She was no longer insisting that every part of Hearthworks had operated exactly as intended. Through the portions Sonia was permitted to share with me, I learned that Serena had started describing the problem as blurred boundaries inside an otherwise legitimate work readiness model. Some assignments may have lasted too long. Some supervisors may have used inconsistent language. Some expectations may not have been communicated clearly enough, but everyone involved, Serena argued, had always understood that work was part of the program. That became the center of her defense. And my name sat inside it. Dad called me one evening after I came home from work. I was standing at the kitchen counter cutting an apple when his name appeared on the screen. The knife remained in my hand for several seconds before I set it down. His tone was different from Christmas night. There was no accusation in it now. He sounded tired, careful, almost conciliatory. That made what he wanted harder to reject. He said Serena was not asking me to lie. She only needed me to confirm what I had already admitted. I knew Hearthworks included work-based training. I had seen participants working. My company had hired them. I had recommended the pilot afterward. All of that was true. Dad framed the rest as fairness. If I acknowledged that everyone understood work was part of the model, the board could focus on fixing boundaries instead of treating Serena like someone who had hidden an entire system. Policies could change. Hours could be clarified. People could be paid where mistakes had happened. Second Hearth could survive. I listened while the cut apple slowly browned on the board. Then I asked him whether he had known, before Christmas, that Darlene had complained about Hearthworks. He went quiet. I did not need him to repeat the whole story. Months earlier, Serena had told him about a former participant who was threatening to make trouble. Dad had already admitted that much. This time, I asked whether he understood that the complaint involved work assignments. He said Serena had described Darlene as someone resisting program responsibilities and talking about unfair treatment. Dad had known enough about Darlene to form an opinion, but not enough to understand the facts, and now he was asking me to do something similar with my own testimony. The sentence Serena wanted was true. I knew Hearthworks included work-based training, but what other people would hear inside it was broader. June knew, as if I had understood the link between housing, client assignments, classification, and refusal. I had understood none of that. The half-truth would work precisely because it was not a lie. That was when the temptation became personal, because the half-truth protected me too. If I confirmed that I had always understood the model, I would look less careless. I would not be the woman who recommended a vendor because her sister's program looked polished from the outside. I would become an experienced professional who had knowingly accepted the structure everyone was now questioning. I could save Serena some credibility and save myself some embarrassment with the same sentence. That frightened me more than Dad's pressure. I ended the call without giving him the answer he wanted. Then I stood alone in the kitchen and looked at the apple I had forgotten to eat. The exposed surface had already turned dull at the edges. The same pattern ran through the phrases Serena relied on: voluntary transition, work readiness, commitment problem, June knew. They became dangerous when the omitted part changed what the words meant. The night before my statement to the review committee, I met Darlene for coffee. She had moved out of the Christmas motel by then and was using short-term housing arrangements, while the larger questions remained unresolved. I did not ask her what she planned to say to the board. That was hers. Instead, I told her what Serena wanted from me. I admitted something I had not said aloud before. Part of me wanted to confirm the narrow version because it made me look better. Darlene turned her paper cup slowly between her palms. She did not tell me Serena deserved punishment. She did not tell me to protect Second Hearth. She did not even tell me what outcome she wanted from the review. I asked what she thought I should say. Her eyes lifted to mine. Say what you knew, not what helps me, not what helps her. Then she took another sip of coffee. That was all. The next morning, I sat across from Sonia, members of the special committee, and the outside reviewers. I knew enough by then not to treat the room like a courtroom. Nobody was waiting for a dramatic confession. They wanted a clean account of what I had seen, what I had been told, and what I had assumed. So I gave them one. I explained that I knew Hearthworks included a training component. I knew residents participated in supervised work readiness activities. I knew my company had hired Hearthworks for limited hospitality assignments and that I had personally seen some participants working at those assignments. Then I narrowed the line Serena wanted widened. I had believed productive work was appropriately paid because Serena told me it was. I had not reviewed payroll. I had not known that refusing certain client service assignments could affect a resident's standing inside the housing program. I had not known how some hours were classified internally. I had not known Darlene's complaint existed. And I had not performed any independent review that justified treating my testimonial as approval of Hearthworks labor or housing practices. I also stated the part that cost me the most. I should have asked more questions before recommending the pilot. I had relied on familiarity where I should have relied on verification. Nobody rushed to absolve me, and admitting the mistake did not make it disappear. Serena spoke after me. I will not pretend I knew what she was thinking. I only saw the way she sat straighter when the reviewers returned to the question of transparency. Her defense remained controlled. Hearthworks had always included work expectations. Community partners had seen residents working. Nobody had hidden the existence of the model. The argument sounded strong until Sonia separated existence from understanding. She looked at Serena and asked one question. If the model was transparent, why did you need your sister's incomplete understanding to defend it? Sonia's question did not end the review. It changed the direction of it. By then, the issue was no longer whether Hearthworks had ever helped anyone or whether Serena had built something valuable. Those points had survived every difficult conversation. The question was narrower and more damaging. How often had one true thing been used to cover another thing nobody had examined closely enough? February passed without a dramatic verdict while outside reviewers compared schedules, payment records, participant files, client assignments, and outcome reporting. Sonia shared only what directly affected me, or what the board later released in writing. In early March, the board placed Serena on administrative leave. Second Hearth stayed open under interim leadership. No residents lost their beds, and Hearthworks stopped taking new outside client work, while Serena lost control over the records and participant discipline decisions under review. A few weeks later, after further findings and a board vote, she was removed as executive director and officer. There was no public spectacle, only written notice, revoked authority, and somebody else doing the job the next morning. The wage issue took longer. By spring, the outside review had separated genuine short training and properly paid client work from assignments where residents performed productive services under schedules and supervision without being compensated as ordinary client service work. The findings were specific rather than sweeping, but they were enough for Second Hearth and Hearthworks, not Serena personally, to begin a corrective back pay process. Darlene chose to participate. The work she had described at the motel was no longer being dismissed as an attitude problem. By early summer, the board had corrected unsupported outcome descriptions and notified affected grant and donor partners. Darlene's old success story disappeared from the campaign page because Second Hearth could no longer use a version of her life she had not lived. Relevant findings moved into Pennsylvania labor and charity oversight channels, and the civil and administrative consequences unfolded over months rather than overnight. By late summer, compensation and reporting issues were being resolved, and Serena entered a negotiated resolution that barred her for a defined multi-year period from serving as an officer or controlling charitable funds for a soliciting charity. The consequence struck at the authority she had trusted most, the right to define what help looked like for everyone else. She came to my house once before the summer ended. I knew she was angry before she spoke, because she kept her purse on her shoulder even after she sat down. She looked smaller without the Second Hearth title attached to every introduction, but not defeated. Serena had never been someone who collapsed easily. She told me the organization could have corrected Darlene's case without tearing open years of work. She believed donor confidence would take longer to rebuild than any spreadsheet could measure. In her version, I had turned a solvable problem into a threat to something that had genuinely helped people. I let her finish. Then I asked only one question. Why had Darlene's exit been described as a successful transition after she objected to the work assignments? Serena looked toward the dining room. The same table still stood there, though Christmas had long since disappeared from the house. Her answer came without the polished language I had grown used to hearing. The program needed strong outcomes. Grants depended on progress. Donors wanted proof that women were moving forward. Darlene had work experience, references, and earlier housing discussions. Serena said she believed Darlene would land somewhere once she left. The sentence stripped everything down. Serena had not known Darlene would be stable. She had assumed it. Then she had allowed the assumption to become the record. You thought she'd land somewhere, I said. Serena's jaw tightened, but she did not correct me. That was enough. The same habit had followed her from Christmas dinner into second hearth. If Serena believed she knew what someone ought to choose, what they probably meant, or what would eventually happen, she became willing to treat that expectation as reality. Her fatal mistake was not simply ambition, it was deciding that her version of another person's future was close enough to consent. Dad's reckoning took longer because there was no board capable of removing him from the role he had given himself inside our family. He admitted eventually that Serena had mentioned Darlene months before Christmas. He knew a former participant was angry about work responsibilities. He knew she had threatened to complain. He had never asked to meet her or hear her side. Then Christmas night came, Serena called, and he already had a category ready for Darlene before I answered the phone. Difficult, ungrateful, trouble. I reminded him that he had done the same thing with me that evening. Serena told him I knew the Christmas plans had changed, and he never checked before deciding my objection made me selfish. Dad looked down at his hands. There was no speech from him that repaired it. What he lost was quieter. He stopped being the person everyone automatically looked toward when a family argument needed a verdict. His informal fundraising role around Second Hearth ended too. Donors who once trusted his certainty now had good reason to question how much of it came from Serena. Mom handled her shame differently. She admitted she had seen women working at Second Hearth events and accepted the phrase paid training because it allowed her to remain proud without asking uncomfortable questions. She had volunteered close enough to the system to notice effort, but not close enough to ask who carried the cost. She stepped away from her ambassador role and supported the new leadership's decision to create an independent grievance process for participants. She did not ask Darlene to forgive her. She did not ask me to tell her she was still a good person. That restraint was the first thing she did that made me think something in her had actually changed. Summer moved toward its end. My relationship with my family remained uneven. Serena and I were not repaired. Dad had stopped issuing instructions disguised as wisdom. Mom called less often, but when she did, she asked about my life instead of using me as a pathway back into Serena's crisis. Then, one August afternoon, my phone vibrated while I was standing in the break room at work. Darlene had sent one message. They paid me for the hours they used to call training. I signed a lease today. Neither one came from you. I read it twice. Then I smiled. For the first time, that last sentence did not feel like rejection. By September, Darlene's new apartment had stopped smelling like fresh paint and cardboard. The first time I visited, there were still boxes stacked against one wall, and a folding chair standing in for a nightstand. The place was small, one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a window that looked across a parking lot toward a row of sycamores beginning to yellow, but it was hers. The lease was in her name. The key was in her pocket. Nobody at Second Hearth could take the room away because she disagreed with a schedule. Darlene had reached it through an independent, affordable housing pathway for older adults. Not through Serena, not through me, and not through some miraculous check that solved everything. The back pay she received gave her enough breathing room to cover deposits, basic furniture, and the kind of ordinary expenses that become enormous when every dollar is already spoken for. She was working a few shifts each week by then, not because anyone had required it. She had found a part-time hospitality job and chosen the hours herself. When I reminded her of what I had said on Christmas night, she leaned against her kitchen counter and gave me the same dry look she had given me outside the warming center. Your retirement plan for me had terrible math. I laughed hard enough to spill coffee on my sleeve. 9 months earlier, that joke would have embarrassed me. Now it felt like proof that the promise had finally been reduced to its proper size. One foolish sentence spoken by a hurt woman who wanted to prove she was generous. Darlene had never needed me to make good on it. She had needed room to decide what happened next. Our relationship remained smaller than the version I once might have tried to create. We had coffee occasionally, sometimes with weeks between calls. She did not invite me into every decision, and I stopped treating that as a problem to solve. If she disagreed with me, she said so. If she did not want help, she declined it. I valued that freedom more than gratitude. Serena's life looked very different. Losing Second Hearth had not destroyed her. She still had a home. She still had skills, relationships, and a life beyond the organization. But the title that had followed her into every room was gone. So was the assumption that she would automatically be trusted whenever her version of events collided with somebody else's. She did not become suddenly reflective or easy. There was no dramatic apology in which she named every woman she had hurt and understood every mistake at once. Near the end of August, she sent me a short message acknowledging that Darlene's exit had been represented inaccurately and that she should not have allowed that version to stand. I read it once, then put my phone down. An acknowledgement was not repair. It was still more honest than anything Serena had offered me the previous Christmas. I did not answer immediately, and when I eventually did, I kept it simple. I told her I had read it. That was enough. My parents were changing in less dramatic ways. Dad invited me to lunch in September. He gave me the date himself, then the restaurant, then called again 2 days before to confirm that nothing had changed. The carefulness would have been funny if I had not understood what it cost him to abandon the old assumption that family plans could simply be interpreted by whoever felt most certain. At lunch, he almost fell into an old argument when Serena's name came up. I watched the familiar phrase form in his face before he said it, the one that usually began with "but family" and ended with someone being asked to tolerate something they would never accept from a stranger. This time he stopped. He folded his napkin once, set it beside his plate, and asked what I wanted instead. I did not have a grand answer. I told him I wanted decisions involving me to include me. He nodded. There was no hug across the table, no promise that everything would be different, but when lunch ended, I noticed he waited for me to choose whether we would make another plan before suggesting one. It was a small thing. Small things had caused more damage in our family than we once admitted. Mom had changed too. Her calls no longer began with updates about Serena or questions designed to pull me into whatever crisis was unfolding around her. Sometimes she called because she had seen a recipe she thought I would like. Sometimes she asked about work and listened long enough for the answer to become about me rather than a bridge back to somebody else. She remained involved with Second Hearth, only at a distance, while new leadership rebuilt the organization's internal safeguards. She no longer introduced herself as one of its proud ambassadors. When the independent grievance process and participant advisory council were created, she supported them without trying to attach herself to the repair. I respected that more than any public apology would have impressed me. Second Hearth itself survived. That mattered. The women living there did not have to pay for Serena's choices by losing their beds. Under interim and then new leadership, the housing program continued while Hearthworks was restructured. Work assignments were separated more clearly from housing eligibility. Participants had a channel for complaints that did not run back through the same people controlling their schedules. The program was not suddenly perfect. Nothing built by human beings ever was. But it no longer required one person to be trusted enough to define everyone else's reality. In September, the new Participant Advisory Council organized a small outdoor meal behind the Second Hearth building. It was not a fundraiser. There were no cameras, donor speeches, or polished success stories printed on banners. Current and former participants had planned most of it themselves. Darlene invited me. I arrived carrying one casserole, only one. That detail made me smile as I crossed the parking lot. Folding tables had been arranged beneath a line of trees just beginning to turn. The air held that first thin edge of fall Pittsburgh gets before anyone is ready to admit summer is ending. Paper plates lifted slightly whenever the breeze came through. Somebody had brought too many rolls. Somebody else had underestimated how much ice a cooler needed. It was ordinary. I loved it immediately. My body reacted before my mind did. I saw one table still missing napkins and started toward it. Then I noticed another stack of chairs against the wall and almost changed direction. There were serving spoons that needed placing, drink containers that could have been moved closer together, and three different things I could have fixed without anyone asking. My hands had already reached for the casserole lid when Darlene noticed. She pointed with her chin toward an empty chair. Someone else had set up covered. I looked around. She was right. People were carrying food, straightening tablecloths, arranging drinks, solving small problems as they appeared. None of them needed me to anticipate what would go wrong next. For a second, standing there with three small problems I could have fixed, I felt the old reflex to take over. Then I put the casserole on the table and sat down. Around me, conversations overlapped. Someone laughed near the drink station. A paper napkin escaped across the grass until another woman caught it beneath her shoe. Darlene lowered herself into the chair beside mine, with a plate balanced on one hand. Christmas had taught me how quickly I reached for a solution when I felt powerless. Give away the food, make an impossible promise, decide what should happen next. By September, the change was smaller and harder. I could notice a problem without assuming it belonged to me. I could offer something without attaching a plan to the offer. I could sit beside Darlene without needing to become the reason her life improved. That Christmas, I thought generosity meant giving away everything on my table. By fall, I understood it differently. Sometimes the kindest thing you can give someone is not a promise, a payment, or a plan. Sometimes it is the room to tell the truth and the dignity of choosing what happens next.